Welcome to this week's episode of What's at Stake. I'm your host, Bryan DeAngelis, a partner here at Penta, and I'm here today with two of my colleagues, our New York City Penta partner and head of the New York City office, Andy Whitehouse, and Penta Managing Director, Jonathan Graffeo, both of you veterans, I would say, at this point on the podcast, but great to have you back with us. You're both experts in crisis and reputational communications. And I thought after, 2023 full of crisis, it might be a good time to explore this topic. Andy, you teach a course on this, on crisis management at Columbia University. Jonathan, again, congratulations, just earned your PhD in crisis communications from the University of Alabama. So who better than to dig into all of this fun stuff than the two of you. So thank you guys for coming on to the show.
Great to join you.
Andy, why don't I start with you? So like I was saying, 2023, we saw a lot of examples of companies navigating some pretty complex challenges, and companies do this every day. Most of these problems don't necessarily level to the true crisis, if you will. Some of them do, and we see those in the headlines, but most don't. So what does it really mean for a brand or a company to be in crisis?
Yeah, I think that's a great place for us to start. And I'm really interested to hear what Jonathan has to say on this too. I think it's my experience from working inside companies now as an advisor, but previously as an executive, was that, as you said, Bryan, things go wrong every day. There are problems and issues that the leaders of companies and other kinds of institutions need to tackle day in, day out. And the good news is most of those don't rise to the level of a crisis. Because if they did, obviously it would be impossible for the organization to function.
Right.
Part of the reality and what it is that crisis really feels like is an entire organization focusing on a particular big moment that has, if you like, almost like an organizational killing potential to it. And most organizations just don't have the sort of the energy and the stamina and the capacity to be able to fight crisis day in, day out. Maybe it's actually a good way to think about crisis. It puts your organization into a serious form of peril. So what sort of things do I look for? I think it's fair to say that things that count as crisis generally are not routine, everyday things. They have a degree of sort of unexpectedness to them. I don't think you can really, if something you've seen coming for a while, you know and expect is going to hit you, it's sort of a little hard to think about that as a crisis. And I think most importantly, it puts at least some subset of your stakeholders into a situation of hurt and pain and suffering that really matters to you as an organization. We put in our class a lot of emphasis on the importance of having the victims of crisis at the center of all of our thinking. I'd love to hear a little bit about how you think about it, Jonathan, too.
Yeah, I think if you look at the literature on this, it bears out what Andy's saying. A couple of the main, qualities or characteristics of a crisis that you'll see. It's very hard to define a crisis. There is not a consensus on a definition, but two of the characteristics that really stand out are that threat element, and like serious, often
threat of a
threat.
license to operate kind of, yeah.
I mean, you're talking about something that is really all-consuming, like Andy was talking about, something that can really impair your ability as a going concern going forward.
Yeah.
So that threat element is key, and then there's a violation of expectations that between stakeholders and the whether it corporation or organization, there are certain things that are explicitly spelled out in those relationships, and then there's kind of like mental kind of contracts of understanding between stakeholders and an organization. And so all of those are, underlaid by expectations, and there's a serious violation of expectations in a crisis too. Not to jump ahead, but Andy's alluding to this. Those are the elements that really spark negative emotions that you see. And we can get into that more. The one thing that I would add is there is no bright line between issue management and a crisis situation. We've laid out some of the characteristics that, point more towards a crisis, but it's very important to remember, especially from a stakeholder perspective, that crises are perceptual. There's a serious subjective element to it, and it really relates to how meaningful that threat is to you as a stakeholder, that personal significance of what's happening. So you really can't discount that. Something that might not look like a crisis to you may very much look like a crisis to me.
Yeah, that's a good point. And we'll break all of this down, but kind of just thinking through that lens, what, in your opinion, then is kind of the most important thing to get right, the most important part of crisis management in that respect?
Yeah, I think so. Here's again, looking at the literature, like it's reputation protection, or is usually what the main driver of, and has been for years, the main driver of what a crisis response should go for. And increasingly, it's now shifting to relationships, to really strengthening and repairing those relationships that are damaged when those expectations are violated in a crisis. And I think it's very important to remember that, yeah, absolutely, your reputation as a leader, as an organization, is very important. But it's also largely derived from either direct or indirect relationships with stakeholders. Yeah. And so I think that's probably the main goal to focus on, and understanding that relationships and emotions are just inextricably linked and are very front and center when you are in a crisis situation. I've done some work with Dr. Yan Jen, who is a professor in the Grady College of Communication at the University of Georgia. And she has...
Great college.
Yeah, absolutely. Except for an Auburn fan. And she has, been working on a framework that kind of maps out crises by the different types of them, whether it's an accident or corporate malfeasance, and then maps out like the most likely emotions that stakeholders are going to feel and how they would cope with stuff. But the point is, when you read about what she's done, she makes a very clear point that it's like, in a moment of crisis, organizations and leaders need to be seen as being there in the moment of need for their stakeholders when things are getting very real for them. And I think it's easy or understandable sometimes, if you're a leader and you're under all these threats yourself, to kind of turn inward. And I think it's very important to focus on stakeholders.
Yeah. Andy, Jonathan mentioned different types of crisis. I know you've done work on this and teach it in your class. How do you think about those different types? And then, maybe a thought on how you manage the most important part of the management piece as well.
Yeah. And I really want to underline that point that Jonathan just made. I love that point, which is that I've seen this so many times that in the context of crisis, I think the natural sort of instinctive thing for an institution and its leaders to do is to turn inwards, because they're experiencing the crisis, and to worry about what it's going to mean for the long-term prospects of the organization. When the research shows, and experience also shows, that doing the unexpected thing of focusing on your stakeholders and the people who are actually suffering as a result of the situation is the right thing to do. So one of the wonderful things I think about thinking about and teaching and talking about crisis is that so often the unexpected move is the right one to make. And the instinctive thing that people tend to do in crisis is unfortunately the wrong way to go. So I'd really underline that point, that even though it feels like the right move as a leader is going to be to protect your organization, if you can keep stakeholders at the center of your thinking, at the center of the organization strategy, I think our view is that you'll come out of it a lot stronger. As far as types of crisis, I think it's a really good question, Brian. And I think one thing that's a bit unexpected about at least the way that we teach our class is that the vast majority of the focus of our time with our students is not on fighting crisis, being in the war room, doing the sort of the stuff that would make for a really good Hollywood movie. Almost all of our focus as a class is actually on thinking about assessment of risk, how to prepare for a crisis, how to do good scenario planning, what is training and rehearsing and building up the reputation of the organization so it's strong when a crisis hits. So our thesis is that many organizations spend 90% of their time fighting crisis and 10% preparing for it and doing all of those sorts of things. And we should really try to flip those numbers around. That if you spend 90% of your time on preventing all of the different categories of crisis, those that you cause yourself and those that are sort of come past and hit your organization from the outside world, that if you're really investing your effort and your time, your resources against the preparedness piece, that you'll come out of the crisis much stronger and you'll end up spending maybe 10% of your time actually doing the firefighting. And it's, again, this is not the instinct of organizations because none of us like doing preventative work that may never get used. But we know it to be true that as in our experience, those organizations that really prepare very practically get a 72-hour head start on a crisis over those that don't have a strategy in place, haven't thought through the possibility of something happening, and so are suddenly presented with this new and emerging situation for which they're really not quite sure, how they should handle it. So again, it's kind of surprising for a class that's all about crisis communications. For us, it's actually all about the task of effectively preparing for, anticipating, getting yourself ready for crisis, so that the firefighting piece that happens in the moment is actually a relatively small component.
Yeah, I think Andy's alluding to a really important, lens through which to view both crisis prep and crisis response. And that's the kind of the level of responsibility that an organization and its leaders bear for the crisis. So in kind of planning things out, you can think of those crisis types along kind of a continuum of responsibility, where it's like maybe it's a natural disaster that hits you. Obviously, you have no responsibility there. You have responsibility to act and take care of
to be prepared
people
to
who
take
are
care,
affected by it. But like people are not going to blame you for it. And then on the other end of the spectrum, there's, again, like corporate malfeasance, stuff that we see quite often. And of course, you're going to be seen to be blamed for that. So it's important to kind of think in terms of responsibility, like in preparing for different types of crises. And in the literature, it's clear also that is the number one factor in how your stakeholders are going to view your response as a leader, as an organization, is kind of that perceived responsibility. Again, it's a lot about perceptions of stakeholders, and that perceived responsibility is probably the central factor that determines that. There are others, but that's the main one. Yeah. So it's a through line in crisis communication, is that level of responsibility.
This was crisis and issues management, maybe by luck, was one of the first things I learned when I got to a firm, and it was a big pharmaceutical company in a major crisis.
You had plenty of it on the Hill too.
We did. We didn't know what we were doing on the Hill, to this day, I feel like 2-3 times a year, I am just absolutely baffled by a company that is seemingly not ready for a crisis or an issue that I feel like most people could have seen coming miles away. So, I to Andy's point, I think a lot in-house, and you've been in-house, Andy, I haven't, there's only so many resources, so many hours. So sometimes that prep get pushed aside, but it's so critically important, and it can really be a game changer to actually managing some of these crises. So
Yeah.
how do you guys think about, helping people prep for these issues?
I think Andy put his finger on it. It's like once a crisis is in your lap, there's only so much you can do based on how well you've prepped for it. And I think a lot of organizations make the mistake of thinking, okay, comms just comes into play once this happens. Comms should be integrated much further up in not just doing their own planning in terms of crisis, but like tightly integrated with the C-suite. You can see the obvious connections to working with chief risk officers in identifying some of these things much further upstream, because your options are going to be limited to the extent that you are not preparing for them. So to me, that's key, is moving comms way further up in the
and you hit on a
decision-making.
big point there that, Andy, I know you've talked about, but knowing who should be in the room, who should be part of an issue management team, to not only make sure you have the right inputs and bias, but just to strengthen decision-making. You can get stuck in a kind of decision-making paralysis, and that's a killer in these crises.
100%.
Yeah. Andy, I know you've done a lot of work on this. What's your thoughts? Yeah.
Yeah, you're right, Brian. So I guess, a couple of things. I think Jonathan makes a really important point, and I've changed my views on this a little bit over the last few years. That I think there are you get judged on two things now. You get judged on the crisis, but almost more importantly now, you get judged on how well you handle it. And I didn't think that as clearly a few years ago, but I've really come to believe that in some ways your stakeholders actually will forgive you the crisis event, because the world is really complicated, and the reality is that most organizations will go through crisis on a relatively regular basis. But I think stakeholders are much less forgiving now of a badly managed crisis.
Yes.
So they may cut you some slack around something going very badly wrong, but if it looks like you weren't prepared, if it looks like you weren't in a place where you could respond quickly and effectively and protect, strengthen the organization, there'll be relatively little forgiveness. I think it's a really important point that Jonathan makes. I would say, as far as preparedness goes, there's really two or three things that I think are essential. The first is that piece about planning. So going to the trouble of thinking through the scenarios that are the most likely to come to pass for your organization, and putting in place plans so you're ready to go, both from a strategy perspective and a messaging perspective. What actions are we going to take, and what are we going to say? Second thing is practice, and this goes to your point you just made a second ago, Brian, that you really don't want to know if someone's going to be good or not in the context of a crisis in the middle of the crisis.
Right.
That is not the time to find out if your team have the necessary skills and capabilities. So if you haven't practiced in advance, if you haven't taken time, which many of our clients do, to go and sit in a simulation, think about how something might play out, put people into kind of put them into a place where they have the opportunity to practice, just as you would for a sports team or for a band or an orchestra. I mean, no one should be going on stage without having done some rehearsing. So second thing is practice. And then the third thing, which sort of cuts more broadly, I suppose, into what we as Penta think about where it comes to brand reputation, is that having a really great reputation going into a moment of crisis when your reputation is going to get damaged, Jonathan was talking about, inevitably is going to mean you're going to come out stronger than an organization who has a kind of a less than strong reputation going in. So all of that hard work that communicators and the rest of the organization's doing to build its reputation over time, to bank the good feeling of stakeholders, so that if something does go badly wrong, you have that credit in the bank. You'll have friends when you need them. It's not much good in the context of a sudden crisis to then be looking around and saying, who are the third parties that then give me support in that particular moment. So having support before you need it seems really important. I think from a
and understanding that support, right? Too. And I've thought about this a lot over the last couple of years, but just like you were saying about practice, knowing kind of where you stand ahead of a crisis. Are you already weak with your customers from a reputation perspective, or do policymakers already looked at you kind of skeptical on some issue? Like, know where you are, know what your reputation is, have that intelligence. So when it hits, or even when you're planning, okay, if we go launch this campaign, we might get whacked by this group because they already kind of don't like us.
Yeah, I think it's important to, like, we talk about reputations and relationships and the importance. Andy makes a great point about kind of pre-crisis, the strength of relationships and reputations there for helping you weather the storm when it comes. Your crisis history is another big determining factor. But I think, like, kind of back to the relationship and reputation points, sometimes I think we all throw those terms around and we kind of all assume that we know what those mean. I guess my point is it's important to think about the factors that make for strong relationships. I mean, you're talking about trust and satisfaction, commitment. So those things are really the elements that really make for strong relationships. And so it's worth kind of thinking about those things in interactions. Yeah,
I agree. Well, one last question before we take a break. And I know the answer, but it amazes me how much people ask me this. Mapping out those issues, understanding kind of the likelihood that they're going to happen, the impact that they would have, prioritizing them. How often should companies be doing this?
I mean, I think my view, Brian, is you should be doing it more than you are.
Yeah.
Now,
my answer is usually all the time. Like, you've got to be thinking about it. You got to kind of make it a priority.
Yeah. I mean, it's sort of a cliche, right? That we live in a complicated, turbulent world, but if it's a cliche partly because it's true, and I'd argue therefore that it's you should be I mean, I think it's always hard to put aside resources. There's a million things you can be doing inside a company to make it stronger, and like I said, a lot of the work will never end up being used. So it does feel like it's a choice to invest in preventative assets that where you could be doing something else. But I would say at least a handful of times a year, it's important for a team to go through a risk assessment and sort of the training and the rehearsal that we've talked about. If you can make time to do it only once a year, well, that's better than not doing it at all.
Right.
I think the reality is that still that most companies don't do this in any sort of structured way. And that feels to me like a sort of unnecessarily risky approach to something that almost, as I say, that the research suggests is going to happen to most organizations at some point.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. Well, let's take a quick break there, and then I want to come back and talk a little bit more about when crisis does strike and some of those best practices. So we'll be right back on What's at Stake.
Penta is the world's first comprehensive stakeholder solutions firm. We are a one-stop shop for the intelligence and strategy leaders need to assess a company's reputation and make decisions that improve their positioning. As executives in the C-suite must account for a growing set of engaged stakeholders, all with distinct, fast-changing demands, Penta provides real-time intelligence and strategy solutions. We work with clients solving complex global challenges across a variety of industries. Our clients span technology, financial services, energy, healthcare, and more. To learn more about how Penta can support your company, check out our website at pentagroup.co, our Twitter at pentagrp, or find us on LinkedIn at Penta Group.
We're back on What's at Stake. I'm with Andy and Jonathan talking about crisis. And guys, we mapped out a little bit some of the issue planning, some of the decision making, having the right folks in the room. But Andy, I want to ask you this. Sometimes a crisis pops up that is not maybe company specific. It's an issue that comes up in society or culture. It can turn into a political football, and companies find themselves just in the crosshairs of those societal debates. How do you approach those types of situations?
Yeah, that's such a great question, Brian. And I know that for our clients, not just here in the US, but in other parts of the world as well, that this is feels like an increasingly important and sort of recurring version of crisis. And I think a lot of companies have a feeling that they aren't as kind of comfortable dealing with the sort of the more political things versus some of the other forms of crisis that we know about, we've talked about. So I'd say, I think one thing that's really that's proven effective for a lot of companies who've really thought hard and worked hard on their values and the statement of values that they put together is that in moments of crisis, those expressions of what it is that the company believes that guide their behaviors can be a really helpful resource for guiding how it is that they should navigate some of these trickier political culture type points of argument and disagreement. You know, I think there's a lot of times companies will put together statements of values, and maybe that they're not as sort of wrestled with and hard thought through as they could be. And that for me feels like a shame, because actually in a moment of crisis, if you've really done the hard work in trying to articulate for the organization what it is you believe and how those beliefs should inform the way that you'll act in those big moments of truth, I'd argue that they're the perfect asset to draw upon to manage a really tricky political question. I'd love to know what Jonathan thinks about this. But one last thought. In my class, we very explicitly don't talk about political crisis. We tend to focus on the nonprofit sector and on businesses, only because I feel like every day is crisis in politics.
Right.
And
you're cutting out all the fun stuff.
That it's just the nature of crisis in Washington and London and Brussels and the other big centers of power in countries across the world. It's just a different business. There's crisis every day. And so I think the rules of the game are a little bit different. But that might be one reason why when companies find themselves in the middle of it, that perhaps they feel just a little bit less certain about how to respond. And, obviously a firm like ours is always ready to leap into the fray to help them out.
Yes. Jonathan, I did want to ask you kind of a similar question. A lot of this does turn into politics, and, even a company sticking to their values, that doesn't inoculate them from attacks from politicians that don't agree with those values. So how do you help folks manage that?
I don't know. I mean, I guess I would just underscore what Andy was saying. Like, you've got to know who you are, why you do what you do, because the tendency, the reason that's so important is the tendency, especially with organizations who are not used to dealing with all these crises, or with all these political issues, but they do see that it's like, all right, whatever's going on may not strictly relate it to my business model, but guess what? My employees care about it. My investors care about it. And so they're finding themselves having to deal with it. I think the worst thing that you can do, and kind of a natural instinct for those who are not used to dealing with it, is to try and kind of put your finger in the air and see which way the wind is blowing, try to appease everybody,
right,
fence straddling. And I think it's the exact wrong move, because, if you're not saying what you actually believe in, and if you're not sticking to that, then you're going to catch incoming one way or the other. I think that's a thing people need to understand in these situations. But be able to stand by what you're saying and say it with conviction and confidence. I think those are the central factors that really that's kind of the touchstone or the North Star in these situations. And it may sound kind of pie in the sky, focus on
no. I totally
values,
agree.
mission, and all that stuff. But it to me, it's important because it's a stabilizing factor in what's always a very fluid situation, and it gives a sense of why you're doing what you're doing. You can be assertive in a crisis. So I think those things are. And
it goes back to that you were saying at the beginning of the podcast, that trust and relationship with stakeholders. So it's the moment I start pulling out my hair when I'm following the news on some company in crisis, and then I see them try to explain the other side and change their position and start. Once you start to cave, you lose everything. And I'm often wondering, like, who is in that room giving that kind of advice? And so I did want to ask you guys, like, what do we need in the room? Like, what are the qualities of a good crisis responder, and kind of what makes them good at their job when they're in those situations, in those war rooms, if you will?
Yeah, it's one of those things, Brian, where you never really know until you've put the team together in the room, which again is a reason, in my view, why rehearsal and role play and wargaming is so important as a way of giving people a chance to figure out if they're good at it, and also to build and develop skills and capabilities. I mean, some of the things that I would look for are some of those sort of, whether it's exactly, they're less technical skills and more just the way that you handle yourself in these sorts of moments of truth. So I like to think that people will be confident and courageous, but not overly confident. You want to respect the process and come at the problem with an appropriate level of sort of humility and awe about what's going on. You need to be you need real stamina, because some crises play through pretty quickly. Others can keep rolling for years and years, particularly if there's a legal component to it.
Sure.
And a legal process to work through. I think having a great sense of judgment, being patient in a context that's going to be complex, and just being able to sort of stick with it over the long term is really important. It's definitely not for everybody, but like I say, that process of training and rehearsal can make everybody, I think, into a pretty good crisis manager, and is a good way of figuring out the people of whom this is a thing that they love doing and a real passion.
Yeah, I think for me, it's all about attitude.
Yeah.
And not attitude in the sense of like kind of a settled belief about something, but attitude almost in the sense of the way that like pilots think about attitude, how you're kind of reorienting to like the natural horizon. That's important in a crisis, just because of the perceptual nature of them, the situational nature of them. No two crises are the exact same circumstances, and kind of the fluid nature and the uncertainty that's involved. So that mindset is really critical. I think, a mindset that's really important is assertiveness. Andy was kind of, there's a connection there with the confidence point that Andy was making. Yeah,
confidence without cockiness. Yeah.
Yeah, but it's like you want to be seen to make clear decisions, and strong decision making is very important. That's why I come back to values. If you're not making those decisions from that place of stability and strength and knowing why you're doing what you're doing, you're going to be in trouble. So that's a key attitude. Andy also talked about humility. To me, that's actually number one. And I actually think it's interesting too, because if you stress the importance of humility to some leaders, they might think of that. Well, a lot of people think of humility as like passivity or is kind of weakness.
Sure, yeah.
Really. But if you look at what it truly is, it's about having that sense of being grounded.
Right.
And understanding what's going on, not being tone deaf, not, kind of going off kilter, but you understand what you're doing. You understand the reality of the situation. And there's also an empathy element to that. that you can put yourself in the situation of your stakeholders and understand why they would react the way that they do.
That's a very good point.
And so that, to me, it's, attitude is really number one.
Yeah. Well, that's great. I couldn't agree more. And I, especially the empathy point, I think, Andy, you hit on that earlier too, but really putting yourselves in the shoes of the people who feel, victimized, if you will, from the crisis. But guys, great discussion. I know, like many crisis situations, there's a lot more we could dig into here, but I'll leave it there, and hopefully we'll have you guys on back again to talk more about this. So appreciate you guys joining this week.
It was fun. Thanks, Brian.
Listeners, remember to like and subscribe wherever you listen to your podcasts. Follow us on Twitter @PentaGRP. I'm your host, Brian. As always, thanks for listening to What's at Stake.